Hi everyone, this is Carly Hasfeld, and I'm presenting on our Week 7 homework assignment where we analyze the book White Logic, White Methods, and I covered Chapter 3 entitled Methodologically Eliminating Race and Racism. And I believe this one was specifically written by Karl Marx. So, let's get into the topic. White majority ideological construct, the concept of race, to use Howard Winnett's terms, is finally obviated and replaced by color blindness and racial pluralism. I wanted to start with the quote from this book because I really do think that this summarizes essentially what Chapter 3 was trying to cover, and talking about how maybe white scientists and sociologists and analysts have taken the subject of race and have essentially tried to eradicate the conversation around race and created almost a colored blindness and a generalization of what it means to have maybe racial discrimination in our society. So, thus, for these scholars, the reality that is racial exclusion and inequality are diminishing, and racism is a thing of the past. It was safer to take race out of the equation, or at least reduce its significance when it comes to inequality. In my understanding, it paints a picture that racism is no longer a large enough factor in society in need of deeper investigation and inquiry. Underlying this thinking has been an assumption by many, as Stanford Lehman once observed, that the good society will be brought about by increments, each one alleviating some suffering, establishing some benefit, until the last and final vestige of oppression, injustice, and wretchedness has been eliminated. This is the thinking at the heart of the traditional sociological imagination. It is also a key ingredient in which I call the elimination process, a practice that predicts and then finds the declining significance of racism, declares victory over the evil past, and moves on to new debates. I believe this to be the main goal of this chapter because we talk about how over time public opinion polls have suggested that racist attitudes have declined. Is the attitudinal decline related to progress and stagnation, to something else other than race? Or is it simply the case, as sociologist Albert Memmi once observed, that despite progress, racism persists, real and tenacious? We'll be getting into this topic further in a few minutes, but essentially, because of the statistics and information that was being collected, we are essentially telling society that the evidence of racism and inequality are diminishing, and that it has led to the misunderstanding and belief that it is actually diminished, where in fact it has not. Or at least in my opinion, it is not, especially given the current political climate and that debate. I would say that it's still pretty prevalent, and hopefully that moment in time, no matter how terrible and sad it is, will actually hopefully lead to more conversations and more change. This is why I agree with a lot of what Karl Marx is saying, because over time, she argued that these problems have magnified rather than lessened, and much about race remains unexplained. Without a convincing theoretical foundation, elimination is not surprising. To me, I wondered, is this because that the people studying and building the scope of these theories and maybe collecting those empirical statistics did not view it as a problem to begin with because it did not directly impact their lives? Or has the attempt to sweep the topic under the rug in fact escalated it because no one is talking about it anymore? This is why I thought noting that in the aftermath of World War II, with the destruction of European colonialism, the rise of the civil rights movement, and the surge of migration on a world scale, the sociology of race became a central topic. Still, making the leap from realizing its importance to attaching it to a theoretical foundation was a formidable task. I thought this was a really interesting point to bring up because to me, I've never really had to study this topic, but essentially, ending World War II gave that new breath of hope and that anything was possible, and why I believe empirical researchers in the 1960s and 1970s nonetheless redoubled their efforts to apply rational thought and greater scientific accuracy to the study of race relations. Essentially, there was a growing respect for science, and statistics offered a way to bring the authority of science in debates about social policy. This might be one of the examples or starting points for why quantitative research has the value and prestige that it does over qualitative, because if people were able to put hard facts and numbers, or so-called hard facts and numbers, to certain societal problems, it was more likely that policymakers were going to listen to it. There was another note for, I think, why quantitative research was pushed is because the sociological acceptance of the biological determinism of race. Essentially, they said that race was predetermined and therefore it really has no factor in why we're even talking about it because there's no way that we can change it. And therefore, it's an outside factor that does not need studying, but maybe the relations between other humans of different races is what we should be studying. I think, too, it's important to note that I caught the fact that there was a growing respect for science, and maybe this is start of the maybe why some sociologists and other people studying human society hold biological sciences in reverence, because this was their way into these topics and studying and understand the societal ecosystem. So, if you're a qualitative researcher, essentially the only question you're being asked to study is what is race? It was left up to the speculative terrain between both qualitative gazers and journalists. This led to the production of knowledge about race and gender and class to be controlled by a small, mostly male, mostly white elite who perpetrate their power by designating, among other things, good and bad scholarship. This was perpetuated in tandem, too, because, as we talked earlier in this semester, there were only a certain number of established and credible journals and publishers that only took certain topics and certain type of work. And that narrow focus led to accusations of abandonment, neglect, and exclusions from those who chose their other methods of research. This is essentially that battle of quantitative versus qualitative research, since this topic of race and social inequality and injustice was something that was being heavily focused on during the civil rights movement. But it was interesting to me to recognize how the ASA reacted to this problem. To quote, "The ASA felt compelled, as a result, to issue an official statement on race. It said in part, sociologists have long examined how race, a social concept that changes over time, has been used to place people in categories. Some scientists and policymakers now contend that research using the concept of race perpetuates the negative consequences of thinking in racial terms. Others argue that measuring differential experiences, treatment, and outcomes across racial categories is necessary to track disparities and to inform policymaking to achieve greater social justice. The American Sociological Association finds greater merit in the latter point of view." And this is where Marx says laudable goals, but ultimately the result is more elimination. It's through this process of elimination, of talking about race and social injustice and inequality, where we get those misconstructions from society of how race is no longer a factor. So let's talk about maybe some of the methods that they used to battle for the high ground on what race is in society. The first method involved testing with large data sets some previously accepted theory. This was the most popular method of doing difference by using race as an epiphenomenon. This is where quantitative researchers really came into play because they were able to take those large data sets and generalize the information to capture race as a whole across the nation versus one localized area. The second involved exploring historical archival data with the intent of illuminating some specific event of the past with implications for the present. This brought to mind of how colonialism played a role in how we even documented our history in the first place. So is there that accurate or maybe some specific event that they could have used to actually determine the implications that race would play on the present? I am in probably the camp of I don't think so, but I guess it could depend on where they were looking. Then the third involved theoretical debates about the construction of race and their intersection with the micro and macro structures. This, in my understanding, is probably the attempt at coming up with that grand theoretical theorem or hypothesis that could explain race as a construct. Unfortunately, though, both the second and third methods or type of exploration were underrepresented in the established journals. This led to the question, what was going wrong in the first method where you studied large data sets? And this is what brought to maybe some of the racism of why race is an issue in the first place. So the first issue would be if the samples of others are too small, just ignore them. Basically, if someone specifically was experiencing discrimination and that didn't occur on a larger scale or didn't happen on a quantitative level that was acceptable, you could just ignore that fact altogether. Second, if the evidence does not support the presence of widespread racism must be disappearing. This is where I think the dangers of generalizations come to play, because if one localized study does not support racism, then racism must just not be happening at all. And lastly, if some others have it worse, then you shouldn't be complaining in the first place about inequality. So, where do we go from this? From the non-empirical side, a consensus emerged that new language and understandings were needed to correct the contradictions. One direction was acceptance that an increasing significance of class did not mean a decline in racism. Racism was ubiquitous and taken for granted. Another direction was the challenge to binary constructions of race. Both sociologists and historians argue that racial categories created by socio-historical processes have changed over time. Unfortunately, though, some of these new directions still do little to explain how race conflict emerges and express itself over time, or what general practices influence its development. But keeping this conversation open, of course, suggests that the concept of race may not have distinct patterns, logic, or consequences, and that the analytical leverage led us again to the notion that race is not real, and so the elimination is complete. In conclusion, standing at the crossroads, both empirical and non-empirical race studies have become fractured and disembodied. This was fascinating to me because this pretty much laid out the road to how we got to this systematic inequality and injustice by white men studying these topics, essentially making the conversation so disembodied and fractured that no one wants to talk about it, and has come to the conclusion that there is no solution and therefore is not a problem anymore. Marx then goes to say, by affirming the unique significance, status, and power of race/ethnic identity as anchor or master factors in the U.S. system of racialized social equality, recognizing this anchor, she thinks, is the first step in conducting research on race and racism. This is the sociological path to developing those middle range theories in the attempt of figuring out that empirical theory of what is race. To her, the real race, in black and white, is the ambiguous between of identity representation and structure that places people in categories that change over time and influence how systems of advantage are manifested and sustained. Essentially, understanding the fact that white cis males were the ones controlling the studies, the papers that were being published, where those papers were being published, what type of data was collecting, and then the conversation around that data was the example of the structure that was in place that allowed for this systematic injustice and inequality between white and black people or any person of color. So this concludes my assessment on Chapter 3, and I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to it. I really appreciate it. And I very much look forward to our conversation on Monday to kind of dive into this topic a little further and get your thoughts as sociologists, how you feel about the creation or the elimination of race as a topic in general.